And we're back. Now let's try that again. And we're back. One more time. And we're back with this video. We're going to discuss active transport mechanisms. We're actually just going to really discuss one of them in this video, and we'll discuss the other ones in the forthcoming videos. But active transport, reminder, when substances move from a low concentration to a high concentration, moving farther from equilibrium. So there's, say, 2 molecules here and 10 molecules up here. You're obviously moving from equilibrium farther from it because that low concentration to a higher concentration there. So moving farther from equilibrium, and active transport does require ATP, not ATV. We're adding ATV. I don't even know what the hell that means actually, but it does not require, it does require ATP. Active transport does require ATP. And in this video, we're going to focus in on primary active transport. So primary active transport, one of the multiple forms of active transport. It's when substances move from a low concentration to a high concentration through a carrier. So it needs to move through a carrier, and ATP is required to phosphorylate the carrier. So phosphorylate the carrier, what the hell does that mean? So example is a substance being transported out of the cell. So what happens, it's pretty freaking cool actually. So ATP breaks down into ADP and a phosphate or phosphorus. So you got the ADP or ATP broken down into ADP and that extra phosphate group there. So the phosphate group attaches to the carrier, which changes the specificity, and it actually, so initially without the ATP or phosphate group, the substance being actively transported, here's the cell, substance being actively transported out of the cell cannot bind to this carrier. For whatever reason, well, actually the specificity, it's not the correct shape, it's not the correct specificity. But when this ATP breaks down into ADP and a phosphate group binds to this carrier here, which allows this little substance to then bind to the carrier because it is now specific, it is now the correct shape to the substance. And even cooler, the phosphate group has a very low affinity, so there's not a strong binding to this carrier, so it eventually spits off, which in turn pushes the substance being actively transported, push it through the cell membrane out of the cell. So let's run that back. Here's the cell membrane, here's the carrier, here's the substance being actively transported. ATP breaks down into ADP and a phosphate group binds to this carrier, makes it specific for the substance being actively transported, which allows it to bind. Phosphate group has a low affinity, phosphate group spits off, which in turn pushes this substance through the cell membrane, through the transmembrane protein, out of the cell there. So pretty freaking awesome. And it all happens just like that. It doesn't take 2 minutes like the explanation here. It happens within a blink of an eye. Honestly, it's incredible stuff. But think of an analogy of so if you've ever been in a sporting event, you're looking at your ticket, you're like, okay, where do I go? Where do I go? You ask the usher to show you where you're at. So the usher will go with you to the row of whatever seat you're at, and then they'll release you or let you go, and then you go through the carrier, if you will, to find your seat number. So the usher is like the phosphorylation of the carrier. It makes it specific. It allows that substance, okay, makes it specific, and then the usher has a low affinity, so it releases you, and then you find your way to the seat there. So that's just an analogy to think of primary active transport. But once again, low concentration to high concentration through a carrier. ATP is required to phosphorylate the carrier, and that's that phosphate breaking off the ATP, binding to the carrier, making it specific for the substance being actively transported. Boom, phosphate group low affinity, so spits off, which pushes the substance through the carrier, allowing it to be actively transported. Pretty freaking cool stuff. How about that?